I swear, the moment that message popped up on my screen, I actually chuckled. Pack your things and leave the house. I have a new wife starting today. Can you believe that? I stared at my phone like it had suddenly learned how to tell jokes. The kitchen smelled like leftover coffee. The afternoon light was hitting the counter just right. And for a second, I thought Robert was trying to pull some twisted prank, or maybe setting up one of those over-the-top surprises he used to botch. My heart didn't break right away. It stalled, confused, trying to make sense of something that shouldn't exist. I even muttered to myself, God, he's ridiculous sometimes. But the more I read it, the more my stomach tightened, like someone was slowly wringing it out from the inside. There was no emoji, no winking tone, nothing that hinted at humor. It felt clinical, like a message you send to a landlord when breaking a lease. I walked around the kitchen in circles, my fingers tapping the counter, my mind replaying the last week. Had he been distant? Cold? I found myself searching for signs I had completely ignored. And still, some desperate, naive part of me kept whispering that I was overreacting, that he'd walk through the door laughing, telling me I'd fallen for something silly again. But then I heard his car outside, that familiar rumble, the one I could identify from a mile away. My breath caught in my throat. Not fear yet, just expectation. Like everything would finally make sense. But when I looked out the window, I saw her. A woman sitting in the passenger seat, chin lifted, hair styled like she had stepped out of a beauty ad. My mouth went dry. Suddenly, every sound in the house dulled, like the world was holding its breath with me. And for the first time, a thin crack of dread began sliding down my spine, warning me that whatever waited outside, it wasn't a joke. I stepped outside, still half convinced I was misunderstanding something, clinging to that tiny thread of hope like it could save my entire world. But the moment he got out of the car, he didn't smile at me. He didn't look amused. He didn't even look conflicted. No, he looked annoyed, like my very presence was some kind of inconvenience he hadn't planned for. And when I asked, with my voice cracking at the edges, "Who is she?" he didn't hesitate. He didn't soften. He didn't blink. He just said she was his new wife, like he had upgraded his phone plan and forgotten to tell me. I felt something inside me snap, not loudly. More like a quiet tear no one else could hear. She stepped out behind him, all gentle blinking and fake humility, as if she weren't standing on the grave of my marriage. She clung to his arm like she'd already rehearsed her role, and the air around us grew thick with humiliation. I could feel my cheeks burning, not from anger yet. No, that came later, but from this deep, soul-shaking disbelief. Robert looked at her with that stupid, puffed-up pride, and then at me like I was the neighbor's stray cat he'd finally gotten rid of. "Did you think I was joking?" he said, and there was this smug tilt in his voice, this quiet threat beneath his words. "I don't need you anymore." Hearing him say that, it felt like being erased. My knees actually weakened for a second. I had to steady myself on the railing because the world spun just slightly, a rude reminder that betrayal isn't just emotional, it's physical. I remember thinking, absurdly, about how he once promised I'd never feel alone with him by my side. And now he was tossing me out like an expired receipt. My heart raced, my palms started sweating, and I felt that cold sting behind my eyes. But I refused to let a single tear fall in front of them. Not yet. Instead, I swallowed everything, rage, hurt, humiliation, and stood there in the doorway of the home I built with him, realizing my life had just been torn in two. But somewhere low in my gut, beneath the panic, something else flickered, a tiny spark I didn't recognize yet. But I would. When he told me to go inside and start packing, like I was some temporary tenant overstaying my welcome, I felt my chest tighten so hard it hurt to breathe. His tone wasn't angry or emotional. It was managerial, dismissive, like he was instructing an employee he didn't plan to pay. And she stood there beside him, giving me this pitying little smile that made my skin crawl. I walked back into the house in a daze, each step echoing louder than it should have, like the walls were mocking me. My hands trembled as I picked up the first suitcase, and I remember thinking, how is this real? How is this my life right now? But beneath all that trembling, something colder, sharper, started threading itself through my veins. I could hear them murmuring outside, her soft voice brushing against his like silk, and him speaking as if I had already ceased to exist. He said it was for the best, that she should understand her place, that he didn't want complications. Each sentence floated through the doorway and sliced into me like tiny razors. And there, holding a dress I once wore on our anniversary, I felt this crushing wave of grief crash over me. I pressed the fabric to my face, breathing in the faint trace of old perfume, and for a moment I thought I'd collapse. But then, just as quickly, something in me hardened. It was like the grief was forging something new instead of destroying me. By the time I zipped the suitcase, my tears had dried on their own, not out of acceptance, but out of shock that was quietly morphing into focus. He thought he was finishing me, erasing me, but all he was really doing was waking up a version of myself I didn't even know existed. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. Red eyes, trembling chin. Yes. But behind all that, a flicker, a pulse, a warning. And as I carried the suitcase toward the door, still unsure of where I'd go or what came next, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't the end of my story. Not by a long shot. Walking out of that house with my suitcase felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare, not mine. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp against my cheeks, and I remember thinking it was strange how the world just continued. Cars passed, birds chirped, a neighbor watered her plants. And there I was, being exiled from my own life while he stood on the porch telling her I was almost done, as if he were supervising a delivery being hauled away. I kept my head high, but inside, everything was shaking. My confidence, my breath, my sense of who I was. It's terrifying how quickly a person can make you feel disposable. He followed me to the driveway, not to apologize, not even to soften the blow, but to remind me that he didn't want drama. He actually said that, like I was the one who had brought another woman home and declared her his replacement. He even waved a hand dismissively and said it was better for everyone if I left quietly, as though my silence would somehow tidy up his mess. And she, that woman with the flawless hair and smug little half-smile, stood behind him pretending to look uncomfortable while clearly enjoying every second of my humiliation. The image burned itself into me, the two of them side by side, united in this betrayal they didn't even bother to hide. I hauled my suitcase into my car with hands that barely cooperated. My fingers kept slipping on the handle because my palms were sweating so much. I felt lightheaded, like my grief was draining every bit of oxygen from the air. I opened the driver's door and just stood there for a moment, gripping the frame, trying not to crumble right there on the pavement. And behind me, I heard him tell her, "She'll be gone any minute." Like I wasn't even a person anymore, just a problem being cleared from the doorway. Hearing that, it didn't just hurt. It hollowed me out. But beneath that hollow space, something darker, quieter, and painfully alive began to stir. I drove away without really seeing the road, my eyes blurring every few seconds as waves of disbelief kept crashing over me. It felt like my mind couldn't keep up with what my body was doing, shifting gears, turning corners, stopping at lights. I kept hearing his voice echoing inside my head, that cold, managerial tone telling me it was time to move on, as if he had handed me a memo instead of detonating my life. At one stoplight, my hand started shaking so violently I had to pull over. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing in that familiar smell of old leather and dust, feeling my entire chest tighten like it was being cinched with straps. I whispered, "Why? What did I do?" Even though deep down I knew this wasn't about me at all. When I finally reached my sister's house and stepped inside, everything hit me at once. The warmth of her home, the smell of dinner cooking, the soft lights, the normalcy. It was like walking into a world that didn't match the hell still ringing in my ears. My sister took one look at my face and didn't ask anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around me. And that was it. The moment her chin touched my shoulder, I broke. I didn't sob loudly. I didn't have the strength. But I shook, these little trembling breaths escaping me as I tried to explain. She listened, horrified, as I told her he'd actually arrived with another woman and said she was his new wife. She kept whispering, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Like she was trying to glue the pieces of me back together with nothing but her voice. Later that night, after a long shower where I let the hot water hit me until my skin turned pink, I sat on the edge of the guest bed staring at the wall. My thoughts moved like slow, heavy waves. I replayed every moment of that afternoon, every expression on his face, every dismissive gesture he used, like waving me off, like shooing away a fly. And the more I replayed it, the more a strange clarity crept in. I wasn't just hurt. I was stunned by how confidently he expected me to disappear. How certain he was that I would crumble and retreat without fighting back. It was almost insulting how predictable he thought I was. And as that realization settled inside me, something shifted. As I lay there in the dim guest room, wrapped in a borrowed blanket that smelled faintly of lavender, I felt my grief swell and break in strange rhythms, like a tide trying to decide if it was coming or going. Every time I thought I was done crying, another burst of pain rolled through me, sharp and unexpected. But then, somewhere between one shaky breath and the next, I realized something. I wasn't just mourning him. I was mourning the version of myself who trusted him blindly, who believed his promises, who thought she was safe. That woman had died on the driveway earlier that day. What was left of me now? It felt raw, but also strangely awake. I sat up, wiped my face, and stared at my reflection in the dark window. The glass showed a ghostly version of me, eyes swollen, hair messy, a tremble still sitting on my lips. But behind that, I saw something else, something steady. A tiny spark, flickering behind the exhaustion and humiliation. Not anger yet, not revenge, just awareness. Awareness that he had expected me to break so completely that I wouldn't even think straight, that I would let him walk away with everything, our home, our money, our life, while he played house with a woman who didn't even flinch at stepping into another woman's place. The more I thought about that assumption, the more insulting it felt. I remember whispering into the quiet room, almost without meaning to, "He thinks I'm done." Hearing myself say it out loud stirred something deep in my chest, something that wasn't fear anymore. It was sharper, clearer, like a thread of steel forming along my spine. He thought today was the end of me. He thought humiliation would silence me, send me crawling away while he rewrote our life without consequence. But betrayal has a way of burning things clean. And in that space, something new begins to take shape. I didn't know the full shape of it yet, not then. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to disappear. Not for him, not for her, and definitely not without a fight. The next morning, I woke up feeling like someone had scraped out the inside of my chest and left only the echo. My eyes were heavy, my throat raw, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I saw my suitcase in the corner of the guest room, and everything slammed back into me like a wave crashing against rock. My sister had already left for work, but she'd scribbled a note on the nightstand. "I made coffee. Drink some. I'm here for you." That simple, ordinary kindness hit me harder than any of Robert's cruelty. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee warming the air, and as I wrapped my hands around the mug, I realized I wasn't shaking as badly as yesterday. Pain still sat inside me, deep and heavy. But underneath it, something steadier was forming. While sipping the coffee, I caught myself replaying every detail of the moment he pulled into the driveway. The way the woman had avoided looking directly at the house. The way Robert hovered just a little too close to her, protective in a way he never was with me. And then it hit me. He hadn't been driving his usual car. He'd come home in a different one. Not the SUV he always bragged about, not the sedan he took to work. This one was unfamiliar, sleek, polished. It wasn't ours. That detail kept poking at my mind, like a loose thread begging to be pulled. Why would he show up with another woman? But not in his own car. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that what he'd shown me yesterday wasn't confidence. It was panic wearing arrogance as a disguise. His rush to shove me out, his refusal to answer questions, the urgency in his voice when he told me not to make a scene. Those weren't the actions of a man in control. Those were the actions of a man terrified of losing control. And the realization sent a cold ripple down my spine. If he was hiding something, and I was suddenly very sure he was, then what happened yesterday wasn't just betrayal. It was a cover-up, a distraction. And if he thought I was too shattered to notice the holes in his story, he was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. Once that suspicion settled into my mind, it refused to leave. It was like a tiny stone in my shoe, small, but impossible to ignore. I grabbed my laptop and logged into our shared banking account, something I hadn't done in weeks. My fingers hesitated above the keyboard, as if part of me still wanted to believe there was nothing to find. But when the page finally loaded, my breath caught. Transfers. Dozens of them. Small enough to not raise alarms at first, but consistent, sneaky, spread out over months, all going to an account I didn't recognize. At first, my heart dropped, thinking maybe he was supporting someone secretly. But then I noticed the amounts had gotten larger recently. Right around the time he became distant, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I clicked through statement after statement, each one tightening something inside me. He'd been draining the savings we built together. Money I earned, money I deposited. Money he promised was for our future. Every transaction felt like a slap layered on top of yesterday's humiliation. And yet, beneath the rage rising in my chest, there was a strange sense of validation, proof that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts weren't lying. I kept digging, opening folders, checking old emails, scanning credit card charges. And then I found something that made my whole body go still, a lease agreement, signed only by him, for an apartment I had never heard of, a small luxury place across town, paid in advance. My hands began trembling, not from heartbreak this time, but from adrenaline. That apartment wasn't for him. I knew immediately. It was for her, the so-called new wife. He hadn't just betrayed me. He'd financially prepared for my replacement, quietly, methodically, like he'd been phasing me out long before sending that message. And tucked at the bottom of the digital folder, I found the smoking gun, a scanned document he must have thought I'd never see. My name missing from accounts that once listed us both. His signature authorizing withdrawals he legally couldn't make alone. And suddenly, the fog in my mind cleared entirely. This wasn't just cheating. This was theft, fraud, a crime he'd tied neatly in a bow, until he pushed me far enough to start looking. I sat there staring at the screen, my pulse thudding in my ears, feeling something inside me flip from wounded to focused, like a switch had finally been thrown. All the pain, the humiliation, the shock. It didn't vanish, but it shifted, tightening itself into a single, razor-sharp line of clarity. He thought he could discard me and walk straight into a new life funded by the one he destroyed. He thought I'd be too shattered to look closely, too heartbroken to question anything, too broken to fight. And the worst part? A piece of him truly believed I would stay quiet out of shame. The arrogance of it, it didn't just insult me. It ignited something fierce. With trembling hands but a steady breath, I forwarded every document to myself. Screenshots of accounts, transfers, the lease, the signatures he never should have been able to use alone. I created a folder labeled in all caps, insurance. Then I picked up my phone and called a lawyer my sister had recommended. My voice shook at first as I explained what was happening, but as soon as I mentioned the unauthorized withdrawals, his tone changed instantly. He said I needed to come in as soon as possible. The urgency in his voice wasn't sympathetic. It was legal, serious. And hearing that, it made my spine straighten. For the first time since yesterday, I felt something that almost resembled power. Before leaving the house, I took one last look at the computer screen glowing in the dim room. It felt like staring at the blueprint of my own rebirth. Yesterday, Robert took a sledgehammer to my life and expected me to crumble in the wreckage. But today? Today, I'd found the cracks in his foundation. And as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, I could feel it in my bones. This was no longer a story about me being thrown away. This was the beginning of the story where he learns exactly who he underestimated. And I wasn't done digging. Not even close. Walking into the lawyer's office felt like stepping into a different version of myself, one that was still bruised, still aching, but no longer collapsing under the weight of it. The reception area smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, a scent that grounded me as I waited. When he finally called me in, I sat across from him with all my printed documents, my screenshots, my notes. My hands trembled a bit when I laid everything out. But my voice was steadier than I expected. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the first page, and within seconds his eyebrows shot up. Then he said something that sent a cold thrill through me. He's in trouble. A lot of trouble. Hearing that didn't fix the pain, but God, it stitched a little strength back into me. As he walked me through the legal implications, fraud, asset concealment, illegal withdrawals, I felt a strange mixture of nausea and relief swirl in my stomach. On one hand, it was horrifying to see in black and white how thoroughly Robert had planned his escape from our marriage. But on the other hand, I finally had something solid, something more powerful than anger or heartbreak. Evidence, truth. And the lawyer made it clear that with everything I had gathered, I wasn't just entitled to half of what we owned. I might actually come out with more, especially if the withdrawals were proven intentional and malicious. I watched him highlight sections, draw circles, make notes, his pen gliding across the paper like a quiet promise. By the time our meeting ended, we had a plan. A real one. Not born from panic or grief, born from leverage. I would pretend compliance. I would act exactly the way Robert expected me to. Wounded, quiet, manageable. Meanwhile, my lawyer would begin freezing accounts, filing motions, preparing to secure injunctions. As I walked out of the building, the sun felt warmer on my skin than it had in days. Not because anything was fixed yet, but because I finally had direction, purpose. And as I gripped the strap of my bag, I felt something rising in me that I hadn't felt since before his betrayal. Control. He thought he had written the script of my destruction, but he didn't know I was already rewriting it. I spent the next few days playing a role so convincingly that even I almost believed it. I stayed quiet. I stayed out of sight. I didn't post on social media. I didn't reach out to him. I made sure every breadcrumb he could possibly see painted me as defeated, lost, licking my wounds. And every hour that passed like that made him bolder, more arrogant, more careless. My sister told me he'd been bragging to mutual acquaintances that I had accepted things, that I knew when to back down. Hearing that stung, of course it did, but it also fueled me. Because while he strutted through town with his chest puffed out, telling everyone he had traded up, I was sitting at my sister's kitchen table, gathering every loose thread I could pull from his carefully woven lies. One afternoon, I drove past the luxury apartment address listed on the lease. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. Just seeing the building, with its glass balconies and valet parking, made my jaw tense. That place was extravagant, far beyond what he could afford without dipping into our shared savings. And as I sat there watching well-dressed residents come and go, I thought about the woman he'd brought home. How she'd clung to him like she'd already won a prize. How she'd smiled that little smile, like she pitied me. If only she knew the truth, that nothing Robert was giving her was actually his to give. That every inch of luxury she touched had my fingerprints beneath it. And sooner or later, she'd understand exactly what it meant to build her new life on someone else's stolen foundation. At night, I combed through more files, more emails, more receipts, each one a little puzzle piece falling into place. My lawyer called regularly, updating me on the motions he'd filed, the accounts that were in the process of being frozen, the subpoenas likely to follow. Every conversation with him felt like tightening a net around Robert. Slow, steady, inevitable. And yet, the strangest part of it all was how calm I felt. Not peaceful? No. But focused, like the storm inside me had finally learned where to aim its lightning. The woman who had cried into a borrowed blanket just days before was changing, reshaping herself around the truth. And the truth was simple. If Robert thought humiliating me would silence me, he was about to discover how loudly a wounded woman can rise. By the end of the week, I could feel the shift, subtle at first, like a faint tremor beneath my feet. People began talking. Whispers reached me through friends, through my sister, through distant acquaintances who didn't realize their words would travel. They said Robert looked stressed, irritable, distracted, that he'd snapped at a coworker, that he'd been spotted arguing with the woman he'd replaced me with, that he kept checking his phone with this tight, panicked expression. Hearing that didn't bring me joy exactly, but it did bring me something steadier. Confirmation. The net was tightening, and he could feel it. And the best part? He had no idea where it was coming from, because in his mind, I was still broken somewhere, crying, hurting, harmless. One evening, curiosity dragged me to his social media pages. I knew it was reckless, that it might sting, but I needed to see. What I found was a collection of carefully curated photos. Him and her smiling at restaurants, holding hands at the mall, sitting on the hood of that sleek car he didn't own. The captions were nauseating. New beginnings. Life upgrades. Finally choosing happiness. And yet, beneath the glossy veneer, cracks were starting to show. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Her posture didn't seem as confident. Their comments back and forth felt forced, littered with insecure little affirmations. They weren't celebrating, they were performing. And worst of all for him, he didn't realize that every cheerful photo was a timestamp that contradicted the lies he'd told about our finances and timeline. A digital confession, gift-wrapped and public. I closed the app and leaned back, the room silent around me as the realization bloomed fully in my chest. He had built his new, perfect life on a foundation made of stolen money, forged signatures, and arrogance. And I was about to pull out every supporting beam, slowly, methodically, until everything he'd built came crashing down, right in front of the woman he threw me away for. As I gathered the last pieces of evidence my lawyer needed, I felt that earlier spark flare into something brighter, something steady. This wasn't just revenge, it was reclamation. The quiet, deliberate undoing of a man who thought I would vanish without a trace, and he still had no idea I was coming. The day I went back to the house he threw me out of, I felt oddly calm. Not peaceful, but anchored, like every step I took was grounded in something unshakable. My lawyer had already filed the necessary documents, the accounts were frozen, and Robert had officially been served earlier that morning. I knew he'd be spiraling by the time I arrived. Still, seeing the house come into view made something twist inside me. It was the place where I had laughed, cried, cooked dinners, held dreams, and it was the same place where he had told me he didn't need me anymore. Walking up the driveway now felt like reclaiming a territory he thought he'd conquered. When I knocked on the door, I heard rushed footsteps and muffled voices, his voice sharp, hers frantic. The door swung open, and the moment he saw me, his face changed. Not anger, not arrogance. Panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. It flickered across his features so quickly he tried to hide it, standing taller, puffing his chest out like he still believed he held any power over me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone brittle. And then he added, "You're not supposed to be on the property." I almost laughed. If he only knew what I knew. If he only understood how much ground he'd already lost. Behind him, she hovered nervously, her eyes darting between us like she was suddenly unsure which side was safer. I stepped inside without asking permission, and the shock on his face was almost satisfying. The living room looked different, colder, less lived in, like happiness had been evacuated along with me. I set my bag on the coffee table and watched him tense, the vein in his neck pulsing. "You should have told me," he started, his voice edging toward desperation. "I would have handled it." He was talking about the legal paperwork, of course, the frozen accounts, the financial noose tightening around him. He said he didn't deserve this, that I was overreacting, that I was trying to ruin his life. And standing there, hearing him twist every wrong he'd done into a wound he claimed I'd inflicted, that was the moment something inside me settled. I wasn't just justified. I was ready. He kept pacing, running his hands through his hair like a man trying to hold his world together with his fingertips. "You blindsided me," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "You didn't have to go this far." And then he threw his arms out toward her, as if she were Exhibit A in his own defense. "She doesn't deserve this either." I had to bite back the bitter laugh rising in my throat. "She doesn't deserve this?" The same woman who stood beside him while he tossed me out of my home like unwanted furniture. The same woman who smirked while I dragged my suitcase down the walkway. She chose her place in this story the moment she stepped out of his car. I wasn't here for her, just like she wasn't there for me. I opened the folder I'd brought with me and laid it out one page at a time on the table. Deliberately, calmly, almost ceremonially. The bank statements, the unauthorized transfers, the lease agreement for the luxury apartment, the forged signatures. Each page was a nail in the coffin he had built with his own hands. She leaned over the couch to look, her face draining of color more with each document. And then she stepped back from him, just an inch or two, but enough. Enough for him to notice. Enough for him to panic. He told her I was exaggerating, that none of this was as bad as it looked, that he had reasons. Watching his excuses unravel in real time was like watching a liar drown in his own lies. Slow, frantic, and inevitable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply said what needed to be said, clearly and without mercy, that he had committed fraud. That he had stolen from our shared assets. That the apartment and gifts he lavished on her were paid for with money he wasn't legally entitled to touch. His eyes widened in realization. Because it wasn't just me he had hurt. It was the law. And it was his bank. And it was his job, which required a clean record. He started sputtering excuses, reaching for my arm as if begging me to fix the mess he'd made. But I stepped back, and he froze. because he finally understood. I wasn't there to save him. I was there to watch him fall. He sank onto the couch like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. His new wife, the one he replaced me with so effortlessly, stood frozen near the doorway, her hands shaking as she processed the truth. That the life he promised her wasn't just built on lies, but on my stolen future. She whispered something to him, something frantic, but he snapped at her, saying she wasn't helping, that she should have trusted him, as if her loyalty could magically erase evidence. Watching the two of them unravel in front of me felt surreal. Days ago they had looked untouchable, smug, and united. Now they looked like children caught playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. He lifted his head with this desperate, pleading expression and said I was punishing him too much, that he never meant to hurt me, that I should remember everything we had. His words didn't sting anymore. They sounded pathetic, hollow, like a rehearsed speech he'd used before on someone else. He said I was destroying his life, and I nearly laughed because the irony was suffocating. All I had done was shine a light on the destruction he created. All I had done was refuse to go quietly. And for the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the man I once loved, not as the husband I tried to save, but as a coward who thought cruelty was power and deceit was strategy. I gathered my folder, zipped it shut, and told him, calmly, clearly, that everything now was in motion. The legal filings, the asset freezes, the fraud investigation, all of it. I told him there was nothing he could say to stop what was coming, because I wasn't acting out of rage anymore. I was acting out of truth. Out of survival, out of self-respect he never expected me to rediscover. He tried to follow me as I walked toward the door, but she stepped in front of him, tears in her eyes, as if she realized she had just hitched her life to a sinking ship. I opened the door, feeling the cool air brush against my skin, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something like oxygen fill my lungs. Something like victory. Something like myself again. It's strange how quiet life feels once the storm passes. Weeks later, I woke up in my sister's guest room, though by then it felt more like my room. And for the first time, I didn't feel that heavy, dragging ache in my chest. The sun filtered in through the curtains in this soft, golden way that made everything look warmer, lighter. I stretched under the blankets and realized my first thought of the morning wasn't him, not his betrayal, not his humiliation, not even the revenge I carefully built piece by piece. My first thought was simply about coffee. And that small, ordinary desire felt like the biggest sign that I had finally stepped out of the shadow he cast over my life. As the legal process unfolded, things changed quickly. The accounts remained frozen. Investigators uncovered even more financial misconduct I hadn't known about. His job put him on immediate leave. And the apartment, the one he got for her, was one of the first luxuries to disappear when the bank demanded reimbursement for misused funds. I watched it all from a quiet distance, not out of cruelty, but out of closure. I didn't need to fan the flames. The truth took care of that. Meanwhile, my share of the assets, protected by the court and backed by evidence, began shifting back into my name. It wasn't just justice, it was reclamation. Piece by piece, I got back what he tried to steal, and with each win, I felt a layer of myself return. One evening, I walked outside with a cup of tea and breathed in the cool night air. I remember closing my eyes and realizing how different I felt. Stronger, clearer, almost new. I wasn't the same woman who laughed at a cruel message thinking it was a joke. I wasn't the woman who trembled while packing a suitcase. That version of me had been shattered, but in the cracks, someone tougher had taken shape. Someone who didn't collapse. She rebuilt. She demanded truth. She defended herself. And she won. And standing there on that quiet night, with the world finally still, I knew something with absolute certainty. The real victory wasn't what I took back from him. The real victory was what I found within myself. A few days later, my lawyer called to give me the final update. His voice sounded almost pleased when he said, "It's done. Everything is settled in your favor." I sat there in silence for a moment, letting the words sink into me like warm sunlight. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not exactly. It was something gentler, deeper, like I had finally exhaled a breath I'd been holding for months without realizing it. After we hung up, I walked to the mirror and caught sight of myself, and for the first time in a long while, I recognized the woman staring back. Not just the outline of her face or her tired eyes, but the core of her. The woman who survived something meant to break her, and somehow came out sharper. I spent that afternoon cleaning up the guest room, folding the clothes I'd been living out of, and sorting through the documents that once felt like lifelines. My sister came in with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me on the bed, nudging my shoulder gently. "You really did it," she said, her voice full of awe. And I realized I had. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't crumble into the version of myself he thought I was. Instead, I found strength in places I didn't even know existed. I fought quietly, intelligently, and with intention. And as my sister leaned against me, her warmth grounding me, I felt something close to peace settle into my bones. Peace I hadn't tasted in years, not even before the betrayal. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about him. Not with love, not with rage, not even with sadness. Just distance. He had become a chapter, not a wound. A part of my story, not the whole of it. And acknowledging that felt like closing a door softly instead of slamming it. I whispered a small thank you, not to him, but to myself. For refusing to disappear. For finding the courage to stand up again. For becoming a woman I genuinely admired. And in that quiet, still moment, I understood that healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a soft breath, a quiet room, and the realization that your heart beats differently now. Stronger, steadier, free. A few weeks later, I found a small apartment of my own. A quiet place with sunlit windows, creaking floors, and enough space for a new beginning. On my first morning there, I unpacked my coffee maker, set it on the counter, and brewed a fresh pot. As the smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, I realized how symbolic it felt to start my day with something so simple. Something that was mine, untouched by betrayal or memories. I stood by the window holding my mug, watching the world go by, and for the first time, the future didn't terrify me. It felt open, like a blank page waiting for the version of me I was still learning to become. Every now and then, someone would mention him in passing, how he'd lost his job, how she had left him, how he was trying to pick up the pieces of a life he'd set on fire with his own hands. And surprisingly, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no bitterness, no sympathy, just neutrality. He no longer occupied any corner of my emotional world. His downfall wasn't my victory. My victory was that I didn't follow him into the ashes. My life had shifted into an entirely different orbit, one where his gravity no longer pulled at me. That realization was the final piece of my healing, understanding that freedom wasn't what I took from him, but what I reclaimed for myself. One evening, weeks after moving in, I lit a candle, curled up on my couch, and smiled. Softly, genuinely, without effort. I realized I no longer felt the need to look back, to reanalyze, to wonder what I could have done differently. I had lived through betrayal, humiliation, and loss, and still found myself here, breathing easier than I ever had beside him. My story didn't end the day he told me to pack my things. It began. And as I closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of my new home settle around me, I whispered into the stillness, "I'm finally free." And for the first time, the words didn't feel like hope. They felt like truth.